Today marks the 65th anniversary of the Supreme Court's ruling in the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education. So that ruling, of course, declared segregation of public schools a violation of the 14th Amendment and ended the practice. However, a study by UCLA's Civil Rights Project and the Center for Education and Civil Rights reveals that segregation in schools has continued to grow over the last 3 decades. According to that study, white students on average attend schools where Caucasian students make up 69% of the student body. Meanwhile, Latinos attend schools where 55% of their classmates are Latin American.
And African American students actually account for 15% of student enrollment nationwide, but are typically in schools with a student population that is about 47% black. So New York and California public schools were the worst offenders for black and Latino students, respectively. The study found that 65% of African American students in New York attend what is described as an intensely segregated minority school. In California, 58% of Latin American students attend intensely segregated schools. So here to discuss these findings and what can be done is the chairman of the House Committee on Education and Labor, Congressman Bobby Scott. Welcome, sir.
Welcome. Good to be here.
So, Congressman, tell us about the legacy of Brown versus Board of Education on this historic date, and what needs to be done in order to address the troubling segregation findings that we just described.
Well, 65 years ago today, the court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that separate educational opportunities are inherently unequal. And for several decades after 1954, the court aggressively pursued a policy to require integrating the public schools. But about 30 years ago, that trend ended, and we started a new trend towards more segregated schools. And schools right now are as segregated as they were in the 1960s. And this is because of Supreme Court rulings, some legislative action, but basically we've just drifted backwards. And according to the court in 1954, that suggests unequal opportunities. And findings show that those opportunities are unequal: less access to better coursework, more over-discipline. The opportunities at the segregated schools are, in fact, unequal.
What can we do?
One of the things we can do about that.
Yeah, what can we do
One
to
of the things we
reverse
can do
the
about that. Well, one thing we did yesterday in the Committee on Education and Workforce, we reported 2 bills. One, the Diversity in Education Act, which is a funding source for technical assistance on how to desegregate the schools. The Supreme Court has actually made it more difficult because a couple of years ago, they found in Kentucky and Washington State that desegregation plans were unconstitutional. Now, you can have desegregation plans, but you have to need the technical assistance and legal expertise to know how to do it right. It can be done, and this funding source will help schools that voluntarily want to desegregate to be able to do so. The other is a bill that would amend Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to give localities, in cases of disparate numbers, where you have a disproportionate number of African Americans, for instance, improperly disciplined, where you have segregated schools, to be able to come in and bring a right. They give them the private right of action to bring a Title VI case. Right now, only the Department of Education can bring those cases. So if the Department of Education doesn't act, nothing happens. This bill would give a private right of action to localities when they are not satisfied with the status of integration to bring their own case. It also creates a monitor in each school. Just like you have in Title IX, you have for sex discrimination, you have a designated person in each college, in each school, to make sure there is compliance with Title IX. We need one for Title VI. And then it establishes a separate Deputy Secretary of Education focused just on school integration and diversity issues. I think this would be a step forward, and hopefully will reverse the trend where the trend is more and more segregation year by year. And it's not only segregation by race, it's also segregation by class. And a significant number of minorities attending schools that are not only racially segregated, but also segregated by class. They're low income.
I think that's a great point, Congressman, and I think it gets to also the way that we do school districting when it comes to property taxes and the inherent sorting within neighborhoods and the way that things are drawn. And I think that might be ultimately the crux of what we're having to get at, which is we have to change the way that schools are districted so that we stop class segregation. Is that your view of it?
The court in Brown v. Board of Education says that the right to the opportunity to an education is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. As you have suggested, it's funded by the real estate tax that virtually guarantees unequal opportunity because the wealthy areas will always have more resources than low-income areas. That was the theory between Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, to put money into low-income areas so that they would have some compensation to adjust for the wealth disparity. But we need to do more. And one of the things that happens with school integration is that, or school segregation, is that the minority schools routinely are underfunded, under-resourced, and when they're integrated, that they tend to be better resourced. We need to make sure that if you have integrated schools, I think the opportunities will increase. But the funding is also important. As you've indicated, when you rely on the real estate tax, you're guaranteed inequity.
Are neighborhoods themselves becoming more segregated?
The fact that you're going to school in neighborhoods and that the fact that neighborhoods are segregated is one of the problems. That's why one of the solutions was transportation of students, busing in the 1960s and 70s. When you have segregated areas, you have to have integrated. It's the only way to integrate the schools is to move them around. Once you end busing, you have challenges. One of the solutions, in fact, was to increase the school district size. You have an inner city where you have an overwhelmingly minority population and surrounded by mostly white suburbs. If you can have the school district sliced kind of like a pie, you can have integrated schools. If you just have persons from the inner city going to inner city schools, they're going to be racially segregated. You have to use your imagination, and that's one of the things that the Diversity in Education Act will do, is help localities figure out how they can integrate their schools.
Congressman, let me ask you, the leading contender for the Democratic nomination, of course, Joe Biden, and he back in the 70s was pretty outspoken opposed to busing, which was, of course, a controversial effort to try to integrate schools. Does that history have relevance today? Is that something voters should be considering?
I think we should consider it, but we're not voting 40 years ago. We're voting today. And what position someone had 40 years ago, I don't think should be dispositive. I mean, you can consider it. But I think we're voting today, and the issue would be what are the issues and what are the positions that he'll take going forward, not looking backwards.
I'm curious. I mean, would you afford that same charity to a Republican lawmaker? It seems like, I mean, it's quite a controversial statement, given at the time in the 1970s when this issue actually mattered. Joe Biden came out against school busing.
Right. If we were voting 40 years ago, I don't think I'd vote for him. But you have to remember that George Wallace, when he last ran for governor, received 90% of the African American vote in Alabama. That's because he had changed his positions, and looking forward, they had more confidence in him than his opponent. So we have to look forward, not backwards.
Congressman, lastly, I wanted to ask you, there's a new development with the SAT test. They're assigning an adversity score to try to reflect some of the challenges that students may have that may contribute to their performance. Is that something that you think is a good idea?
Well, one of the problems with the SAT is that the scores you get are more correlated with your zip code than your achievement, and so they're problematic. This would have an adjustment. I'm not sure that it's the perfect way to do it, but it does recognize that the raw SAT score is not a good predictor of how you're going to do in college, or a fair way to screen students and who gets a good opportunity and who doesn't. This adjustment is just I think it just begins the debate on the usefulness of the SAT score and how you allocate the opportunities going forward, whether or not a person who was relegated to an unequal educational opportunity in an inner city and does okay, or someone who has a much better opportunity and does just a little better, who ought to get the opportunity to the prestigious school. I think this adjustment shows that the debate is not over.
I said that was the last thing, but I actually have one more question for you. There's been a pattern of a number of President Trump's judicial nominees declining to answer whether they think Brown versus Board was correctly decided. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that it raises questions as to whether they actually believe it was correctly decided. If it was held today, would they have voted to integrate the schools, or would they have taken the position that the Supreme Court has taken in a couple of cases more recently, where they found that school integration plans, desegregating the schools, whether or not those plans were in fact constitutional or not, this court ruled that they were unconstitutional. It raises questions as to whether they believe that Brown v. Board of Education was correctly decided, and the fact that they refused to answer only emphasizes the question of whether or not they really believe that segregated schools are inherently unequal. We don't know, and they wouldn't answer.
Congressman, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
We really appreciate your time. Great to see you.
Chris. Thank you.
Coming up, President Trump called his latest immigration proposal, quote, pro-American, pro-immigrant, and pro-worker.
But will his plan help relieve the overwhelmed border agents dealing with the unprecedented number of migrants crossing the U.S. southern border? Border Patrol's Law Enforcement Operations Chief Brian Hastings weighs in next.